Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by EyePatchNotes. I hope you'll enjoy listening. Let's see what they have to say. This one I'm going to call a crazy cook theory and filling the space. EyePatchNotes begins. I did want to tackle a recurring statement, possibly the kind of statement I have the most violent reaction to. This is something I say. They struggled to fill up the design space. No, EyePatchNotes says, get that developer out of the driver's seat and find someone else. In accordance with crazy cook theory, having an unwilling or unknowing kit writer is a grave sin. Get a visionary who truly, madly wants to push the envelope, making a character dense, usually via multiple mechanical clauses. If the alternative is stretching a character thin, spreading a basic system pattern across multiple kit elements. There's a lot more, but already something to respond to. Yes, EyePatchNotes is very frustrated by the idea that there would be any need or idea of that somebody whose job is a game developer would have trouble filling up the design space. Let's talk a little bit about what that is. What would be an example of that? Filling up the design space, having there be enough effects that everywhere in a game that there, is a spot for an effect or whatever, all the mods or all the passives or all the equipment or something, that they all have effects that you want, that you care about. Now, part of this is obviously designing a game that has enough things to put in those spaces, that the game has enough design breadth that there are things to put there. But taking it as a given that a lot of games do, let's just leave it at that, or they could, it's weird to have a developer for whom it feels like you're looking at a game piece and saying, it doesn't feel like you knew what to put in these spots. This is EyePatchNotes' thesis. Let's see an example. For example, EyePatchNotes says, I love Hu Tao, holistically, in Genshin Impact. Vary almost entirely, from voice acting to costume to mechanical design. If we go back to the Rogue Constellation parlay, Hu Tao's Constellation 4 can never benefit herself. As stated in that parlay, EyePatchNotes, prefer a constellation design that makes the player whip around looking for a use case. The emotionally invested player will likely choose Constellation 6 regardless of whatever dud or not is present at Constellation 4. So the noble developer, in my mind, will throw a curveball that increases the chance of that character will be used for their rogue effect instead of or in addition to their normal kit. So what does this mean? On Hu Tao, you can see a really good example pattern. Her constellations 1 and 2, EyePatchNotes has written, it's me, I'm the star. This character is a higher rarity character in the game, and characters have a variety of passive effects if you get more copies of them. The first two, as you might expect, are for that character. You may have invested in this character because you like them. That's easy to imagine. And so, of course, the design is usually that the first two constellations support them attacking or doing stuff on the field, is the point. Now, EyePatchNotes is making a claim here that players will pursue all of a character they like's constellations. And I'm going to put that aside for now. Neither of us can really demonstrate that one way or another, but I think it's fair to say that if a player is the type of player where they're just going to get more of the character they like, kind of no matter what, they're going to get constellations on the way. Giving them a few things that suit probably why they wanted that character right away, and then some kind of ultimate effect at the final constellation, that seems sensible. And so EyePatchNotes argues you should put any effect that's a little weird at Constellation 4, like in the middle of the 6. So as the player is acquiring more copies of the character, there's a moment when they're way invested, they're probably going to keep going anyway, you're not going to turn them off to the character. You give them a weird little effect, and you put that at Constellation 4 specifically, or around there. Interesting. So for Hu Tao, I actually don't remember off the top of my head what this effect does, but it's similar to one of her passives that she has, where when she swaps off the field or her skill ends, the team gets a critical chance buff. Now, Hu Tao has a skill that makes her attacks very powerful. It gives her a lot of attack based on her HP, and it makes her do pyro damage with her attacks. And when that ends, and it is only up for about 2/3 of the time, the team gets a crit buff, so that whatever you're doing in the meantime, while you wait for that to come back, they're stronger doing it. Now, I don't remember off the top of my head what this Constellation 4 effect is, but it's pretty much the same thing, if memory serves. It's the same idea. They get the rest of the team gets some benefit while Hu Tao's downtime is happening. And so, as EyePatchNotes puts it in that section, okay, your turn. There's a little clause in the character of, this is another thing you can do with them. Maybe the player up to this point had been using Hu Tao only on the field, and they didn't really think about anybody else. The other characters are just backstage. Now, broadly in Genshin Impact, that isn't a very effective way to build a team. You don't have to put any passives like this in the game. It's already inefficient to play that way. But one good piece of game design is pointing the characters in the direction of what you think will be fun, and then rewarding that fun with power. I think that's cool. And if you can swap between 4 different characters, encouraging the player somehow to do that isn't a bad idea. I think this is an interesting kind of subcategory. This is sort of a little aside that I'll keep minimal because we have a lot more Parley to go. But Constellation 4 Hu Tao, that is difficult to acquire if you've been playing Genshin Impact even for a long time. If you were to pay real money to acquire Constellation 4 Hu Tao, that would be a lot of money. That would be a lot of money. And so is this for the whales a little bit? Now, I completely acknowledge EyePatchNotes' idea that, in the long run, a player, even a player that's completely free to play, might just save up their currency to get more constellations for a character. But it's worth noting that this is really quite far into the game that you'd be getting that, right? If you were a free to play player for literally since the beginning of Genshin Impact, it's quite possible you would not have Constellation 4 Hu Tao, and it's been, going on 3 years, right? It's very possible you would, just barely, but it's depending on how you saved, it's very possible you would not. So I think it's worth noting that for a player that didn't whale, it's hard to believe that they really need encouragement to use their other team members after 3 years of playing the game. I don't know. I say this, and yet this is not really meant to be attacking this premise, by the way. I think the idea of the C4 is something different and makes the player play the character in a different way. I think that makes sense. I don't think that's an absurd claim at all. I just want to point out that maybe this doesn't really do anything for us except for a subset of players. I have definitely seen people asking for help on Genshin Impact, forums or the subreddit, saying help, I just can't get through this piece of content. I have all my characters maxed out. I'm doing everything right or whatever, but I just can't win. And then they show their team composition, and they clearly just don't know the game mechanics at all. It's not even them being stupid or not understanding or something. There's no shame here, by the way. Just that they clearly just don't know what any of the game mechanics are. Things like in Genshin Impact, it would be elemental reactions or how to increase your character's damage a little more effectively and stuff like that. Pretty basic stuff that the game does tell you. The game does tutorialize, elemental reactions. But they must have a background of games where it's just pay to win, and so if I just have the rarest characters, I'll win, right? And that's really not true in Genshin Impact. That they're pretty useless unless you make a team around them. And that team doesn't, it's irrelevant whether the characters are, one rarity or the other. So I wonder if it's with a mind to those players. I wonder, that's just an aside I wanted to put here about how having whales, they're referred to, people who are going to pay, huge amounts of money on the game, how having whales might change design, how you might design things kind of specifically for those types of players, in the domain of those types of players. We will come back to this point in a little later. Continuing on. EyePatchNotes is going to talk about Hu Tao's Constellation 6, which we said everybody was going to build to. We see, oh yeah? What? EyePatchNotes says, however, Hu Tao's Constellation 6 borderline offends me. Only borderline since it's objectively useful, but I will never see myself targeting it. Even if it is effectively guaranteed, and I seldom roll for characters I have no emotional stake in, Hu Tao's banners are not worth the months of saving for me. For a summary, Hu Tao gets a benefit for 10 seconds of every minute. The mechanical effects have a 60-second cooldown, triggering when Hu Tao's HP gets low. Now, what are these mechanical effects? It increases her crit rate to 100%, and it decreases the damage she takes by a lot, like 67% less damage, a lot. Okay? There are 3 massive issues I have with this effect. First is that regardless of how robust the effects are, they are severely time-gated. Compared to C6 effects that trigger on a character's burst, a 60-second cooldown is at least 3 times less frequent. Indeed, that makes it quite awkward to build around. Second is that this effect only increases Hu Tao's crit rate to 100%. Genshin Impact is not Warframe, and I think orange crits, or like critting over 100% twice, would cause more problems than they would solve. But the fact remains that this Constellation 6 is active only once every minute for 10 seconds. Even if we abstract the condition to once per domain, or like an open world fight, getting 100% crit rate conditionally does not alleviate the responsibility of building crit rate. As soon as Hu Tao's 10 seconds of fame ends, all the crit damage in the world would not help if she threw out her crit rate in exchange. That is to say, the player would be doing themselves a relative disservice to keep crit rate as low as possible to maximize the benefit of her Constellation 6. Or another way I would put this is Zandy and not EyePatchNotes here, is that you're better off pretending you don't have this effect. It's a damage increase, and a good one, when it happens, but you're better off building Hu Tao as if this effect doesn't exist, which I think is not good. If it was something like crit rate goes to 100, for each point of crit rate you had, you get a little crit damage, something like that, then you still get a benefit for having built the crit rate, you know? But this way it's like, during this 10 seconds, I guess you could build her all crit damage and then just do absolutely absurd damage for 10 seconds, but then loses an enormous damage multiplier for the 50 seconds out of 60. I don't know, that's weird. Anyway, back to EyePatchNotes. Most damningly, EyePatchNotes concludes, I want to revisit the trigger condition and Hu Tao's overall goal, staying at low HP. I would like to think that both player and developer alike know that the cleanest, most straightforward way to keep a character alive at low HP in Genshin Impact is shielding. Putting aside invulnerability frames, putting aside physically avoiding attacks, shielding Hu Tao to prevent an untimely death has been a solution since Constellation 0, i.e. the player's probably been doing it for a long time. When Hu Tao has the invisible HP from a shield, and the player puts forth a reasonable amount of effort into making that shield bulky, I would argue that damage reduction is moot. Although, as an aside, do note that damage reduction actually does affect shields in Genshin Impact. So it's not like it doesn't do anything, it's just unnecessary, EyePatchNotes is arguing. Devil's Advocate might say, well, Constellation 6 allows Hu Tao players to not run a shield if they don't want to. It purely increases team diversity, and well, sure, that's true in some sense. It also means that shield-based Hu Tao teams get a, to you, imperceptible benefit as the developer's final statement on a character. Nothing remains after Constellation 6, the character's internal narrative has ended, and all that is left to do is wait for more content. So the idea here is that this effect feels a little hollow to players that understand the game, basically. If you have been playing Hu Tao for a while, and you understand the game's damage, you would not build toward getting your crit chance knocked to 100% for a few seconds, because it isn't active often enough. And you wouldn't build toward having extra damage reduction, because it isn't active often enough, and it's unnecessary. It's just not that hard to work around. Hu Tao does get a pretty substantial damage bonus for being at low health, 50% or less health. And so using a shield can be really effective for that. But as much as this could, in theory, help, the way that it's done is just odd. And indeed, I have another point to add. I think that a lot of players actually don't wish to change how they play a character after this amount of time playing the character, you know? I think that the idea of having constellations or passive effects in a game that sort of switch up your favorite character you've been enjoying or whatever, and you're doing something new and refreshing with them, that's interesting. I think it's critical to think about what happens on the ground. Now, I'm not all players, but what I've seen personally, is that people don't want new ways to play their character forever, or they don't seem to want these things. I guess we can't know that for sure because we don't have infinite. Anyway, usually I see people have like an initial impression and then there's a period where they kind of revise that impression. But here's my point. If the player has had enough time to have thought that over, and there was also, by the way, in Genshin Impact, apparently already a constellation that encourages them to use the character differently, does it make sense to have a constellation at the end that would really only reward you if you played the character yet differently again? You see what I mean? I don't know. So if the point of this was, EyePatchNotes, you said devil's advocate, it allows players to not run a shield if they don't want to. I don't know. I feel like many players, if they were doing it and it was working for all that time and then they got that constellation, I'm not sure I think they would or would want to change that. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes you very, very durable. I think that the key with this effect is that it's when her HP gets low, and then you get a big damage reduction boost. If the idea is supposed to be that it's a fail safe when her HP gets lower, in other words, you're rolling along hunky dory, you're fine, but then it triggers when her HP is like really low and she might die and she gets a ton of damage reduction. That sort of makes sense. You don't look at it as an effect that's active all the time. I still get your point though. I think that even for like it obviously does something. It is objectively useful, as you say, but it doesn't really feel like something that really changes anything. It doesn't really do anything sort of beyond just make Hu Tao work through a little more hardship in a situation where you imagine the player this invested in this character has probably already had it working for quite some time. So let's finish up the parlay. EyePatchNotes says, cutting to the point, EyePatchNotes firmly believes that Hu Tao's Constellation 6 is not penned by someone who truly understands what systems she has access to. Which is a shame, since I think Hu Tao's Constellation 1 and 2 do demonstrate a clear narrative of her charge attack cadence. See, Hu Tao's damage over time effect almost lines up with her skill's uptime. 9-second duration on the skill, 8-second damage over time duration, 16-second cooldown, but only if Hu Tao does nothing else but attack. In other words, if you do charge attacks the whole time and apply her damage over time effect over and over again, the damage over time effect will be going off for almost exactly the time that her skill is down. Therefore, you're still doing a little bit of damage with her. You're getting pyro output or whatever. Yes, an elegant little timing thing they put in. Constellation 2 bridges the gap between her skill ending while she has her signature attack buff and her next skill use, all while buying time to refresh buffs outside of Hu Tao's kit. Shield, Hydra applications, you name it. The elegance in my biased eye is that should the player not grasp any of that nuance, Hu Tao still gets a damage increase in the same breath. Within the same block of text that has all this nuance, there's a superficially intuitive HP scaling clause that mentions her burst by name. In other words, an on-brand constellation with a riding effect, or some breadcrumbing to lead the player to weave Hu Tao's burst in if they were not already doing so. I don't know what this means, and that's because I don't know what Hu Tao's Constellation 2 does, so let's look that up. But the idea is that the narrative seems sensible, except in the Constellation 6, and so what's up with that? But let's read what that effect is, just to make sure I'm on the same page as much as possible. It's called Ominous Rainfall. It says, increases the Blood Blossom damage, her damage over time effect, by an amount equal to 10% of her max HP at the time the effect is applied. Also, her burst applies the effect. I see. Cool. Yes, so the damage of her damage over time will be a lot more substantial during the time she's down, and she can also weave her burst in to apply it. And the idea is that it's weird that, again, EyePatchNotes says, I believe that Hu Tao's Constellation 6 is not penned by someone who truly understands what system she has access to. And one of those systems is that if you're panicked and low health while playing this character, you can use her burst, which, heals you back up. She kind of already has something in her kit that does that. So it's a little weird. Um, yeah, I want to put in a little note here that I would be interested. I don't think this happened, but you could imagine that a developer might put in an effect like this. And to EyePatchNotes and I, it seems a little weird, but it could have been because they did a really good, huge amount of playtesting or something, and that's what players said they wanted. You know what I mean? They said, like, if anything, I would want another fail safe at low health. And let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that these were players that were using everything this character had access to. And it's just that the balance of the character led to those people feeling like, I would like a little bit more of a defensive net. And so they thought, okay, let's make that the Constellation 6 effect. People might not know if they would like it, but most people won't do this lengthy analysis that EyePatchNotes and I are doing, and so they won't even think about whether they like it, and then they'll get it, and they will like it, according to our data. But again, to clarify, I can practically assure you that isn't what they did. But you could imagine such a developer where that did happen. I'm sure plenty of developers, that is how they would do this. In this case, I'm rather confident that isn't what happened, simply because this character does such an apocalyptic level of damage that, at the very least, the player that understands the game's mechanics, I just can't really imagine you having that much trouble. And the game offers enough really strong shields, that in particular, that I really don't see you dying frequently when you can make the source of the damage die so quickly, because Hu Tao does so much damage, and there's so many good enablers, some of which are cheaper characters, some of which are more expensive characters, to have built or to get to do the support, or at a different constellation or something. It's just not that hard. So I find it quite difficult to believe that in this case. But I did want to note that although there would be problems with that design, if they had kind of surveyed enfranchised, knowledgeable players and they said that's what they want, there's still problems with that design, but it would be interesting if that was the case. If we could see approval ratings for the effects. They would never do this because there'd be big "this is bad" markers all over their game. But imagine if next to each constellation it said, how many players like this or don't, that own it. Of course, there'd be a bias. A player with enough sunk cost fallacy to own Hu Tao's C6 probably isn't going to say they didn't like it. It's that whole thing with the subject is given 5 pictures or pieces of art, and they say you rank them in order of how much you like them, from least to most. So they've got 5 pieces of art. They're ranking them in order. I like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, this is how much I like this one the most. The subject is then given a piece of art that wasn't their favorite, that was like one of the ones in the middle or something. Studies have shown that people retroactively, when asked to rate the pieces again, they rate the one they got higher. Now, I don't think that it's entirely scientific to suggest that means people, lie to themselves that they like the thing they got better. I think it's very possible that a reason is that they learn the merits of the thing they did get. You see what I mean? But absolutely, it does bring to mind the idea that maybe the person kind of just coped with the fact that they didn't get the one they wanted, or they've waited all this time and then this is all they got for a constellation, and they kind of coped with that by convincing themselves they like it more than they do. Again, I just think that a caveat there is that perhaps the player actually does like the effect a bit more than they thought they would, or they play in a way where they have fun with it. And is that really bad? But from a game design perspective, it is bad, actually. In the painting example, I mean, if it's a piece of art you have and you learn to like it, like, that's great. You know what I mean? There's really no drawback there. But this is a video game, and the developer can change it. And designing the thing that the player will have the most potential fun with is your job as a developer. And so I don't personally think that it should be considered validating if it was revealed that players say they like this constellation a lot. For you as a developer to do your due diligence to make the game as fun as you can make it within reason, that's not enough. That's not good enough. You have to ask, what could the players have liked more than this. It's not enough just to say that everybody does like it. You should be imagining what could people like potentially. This is the sort of threshold of innovation that things like the iPhone, when it first came out, were suggested to have. You can't just say, do people want a small computer with a touchscreen as their phone? Like, well, they don't, because they don't know about that. That is not existing. And so you you need to imagine whether they maybe would like that if it existed. What could they want if it were offered? And I think that this is an example of this game maybe not doing that. I think we can agree that at the very least, this isn't a different direction for the character. It definitely isn't something new for the character. It doesn't feel like it shakes it up the same way. I will give a counterexample of a design in Genshin Impact that I think does do a good job a little bit later if we have time. But let's finish reading the parlay. EyePatchNotes concludes, notably, in all of this word vomit, I did not actually suggest what Hu Tao's Constellation 6 could or should do instead. And I, Zandy, tried to avoid doing that as well, even though personally I'm going to go on to argue that you should do that. EyePatchNotes says that this is due to the calculated narrative of Hu Tao's Constellation 6 being at odds with the game, and a reader would have to attack my interpretation of the objective first-party text rather than a self-indulgent rework. I think what you mean by this part, it confuses me a little bit, but I think what you mean by this part is simply that you don't want people to critique your rework idea and thereby get kind of distracted from the main point, which is that it doesn't feel like it's consistent with the game's own logic. It's the game's fault that it's weird, not your fault for not like coming up with a rework that the player likes. And indeed, I would argue that philosophically, it's productive to suspend our disbelief that way. Just because EyePatchNotes or I can't produce a design that feels better than this one doesn't really mean anything at all about whether or not there is one. Sure, I agree. Now, personally, I really strongly advocate coming up with a design you would prefer, because I think it demonstrates one's biases. I think it can be legitimately good advice, although developers should really be wary to generally not implement anything that the player has suggested directly without very careful scrutiny, because they're usually not very well balanced ideas, but what are you going to do? They can be good ideas, they can be inspiring, maybe just not as is. And I also think that it is a reasonable exercise of faith. Sometimes it might be easy to understand why a design was made. If you try to design it a little bit yourself, you might notice a roadblock. It probably won't be that your design itself will help you understand why it wasn't made that way, but the process of making your own design with that character's kit, for example, might illuminate reasons why it was actually more limited or more difficult than you maybe at first thought. I'm not really speaking about Hu Tao specifically. I actually completely agree that it's a weird constellation, and I'm not sure what else I would want. Maybe something like Blood Blossom duration is a lot longer, or you get elemental mastery from her her stance ability, her pyro damage ability, her skill. But I do think that I'm a big advocate of trying to give a suggestion for something you think would be better when it's critiqued. I don't think that it's like not wrong of you not to, but personally I think it's good to do that. And generally, my philosophy is the philosophy of my whole channel on this point. If a person would be distracted from your legitimate point just because they nitpick a little afterthought bit, that person is useless for discussion anyway, and they can just be safely ignored. They don't matter. The old people who mind don't matter, and the people who matter don't mind. I do think that's a threshold. As a creator, I've really struggled a lot with like, who do you just admit that you can't convince? Like, people are just going to be annoying, and I'm not going to force myself to find a way to convince people who have this idea. Absolutely. But my personal thought, just since we're here and that's the show, is that you shouldn't care if people, one or two people nitpick the suggested idea you have. those people are getting caught up on the details, and that isn't useful for discussion. I generally suspect that those people wouldn't have like magically been super productive if you just didn't distract them. You know what I mean? It's not your fault. It's they were never going to be a person who wasn't going to get hung up on things like that. They already were like that. You did not make them like that. But I don't know that. That's just my opinion. Anyway, I just think that's interesting as a brief aside. Overall, I really like the way you approached this critique. You did a good job showing the audience. Like if this had been a Zandy Pants video, I think you did a good job structuring it. That's all I'm trying to say. While I can and do agree, EyePatchNotes continues with the sentiment that no single person knows all builds. The corollary I'd like to add is that someone should own some of them. If we accept that a developer is padding a character's kit due to not knowing what else to do, that takes us back to crazy cook theory. The development environment is in my heart is crowning champions of specific game concepts. Developers who really like normal attacks, developers who like swapping characters constantly. Anything goes as long as there are dreams behind it. Seeing bland or catch-up mechanics saddens me, as I cannot believe that a knowing developer would have willingly turned a blind eye, hence noblesse oblige. The idea here is that the specific type of not understanding the systems available that EyePatchNotes feels the developer is guilty of with this constellation is that they don't have a vision for the character. I think you hit the nail on the head. That's a great way to summarize it. It's not that it's a nonsensical effect, right? We're not saying that this effect makes no sense, doesn't line up with reality. It's not a thing that's even related to Hu Tao. It's not random. It's not a random choice. It makes perfect sense as per se, but it just doesn't seem like it's in line with a fantasy that it enables. Maybe this is overly critical, and the developer's fantasy that this is meant to enable is Hu Tao being at dangerously low health, right on the verge of death. That's kind of related to her character's lore, too. And yet she's cranking out damage, and she just won't quite die. That's a cool idea. Again, the problem is that if you've been playing Hu Tao up to getting this effect, like that, she already does do that. And she probably shouldn't not do that until you have 7 copies of her. That would take years of investment if you're not a whale. You see what I mean? So maybe they have a vision, but they're not in touch with reality. Maybe. That's my counter suggestion. However, I personally agree with you. It kind of feels to me like they were told this is what this character does, and then they just gave them a buff to doing that thing at the end without really thinking about, how could you really push that forward, For example, something that I think would be, just to give my own recommendation now that I said you should do that, I think something as simple as just giving her, I suggested an elemental mastery buff, but maybe a crit damage buff, when she is below 50% health, just like her pyro damage passive already asks you for, would be better in the sense that it just more clearly understands what players are doing and what would be valuable to them. Again, the thing where you max your crit chance and then you get more crit damage for crit chance you already had built, that would be fine. That'd be cool. I don't know. The damage reduction thing also makes me feel like that's a big problem with a lot of the Constellation 6 effects is they're kind of unbalanced. You know what I mean? Like, I would argue that it's in the name of gameplay tension. It's very game-like to let the player remain vulnerable defensively while at low health as Hu Tao. That feels like part of the fun of the character in some sense, and it makes the character balanced in a way that makes them feel meaningful. It's like not like her HP bar disappears and doesn't exist anymore, right? She is really on the verge of death. You haven't just completely negated that risk, which is what I feel like the current design does. Also, I don't know how the current design triggers, but if you get at low health and then it triggers, a lot of people just keep their Hu Tao at low health always. The Hu Tao is never above 50% health. And so whatever the triggering threshold is, it's conceivable a player might simply never be above it, and therefore it would never trigger. That was something I thought. I don't know. That probably wouldn't happen the way I'm playing Hu Tao, but I don't know. Just to say that I think that the subtext to this whole conversation is the whale bait. I think that a very important part of this discussion is the consideration that this constellation wasn't made with any of this thinking at all. The developers were thinking what I originally suggested when I started playing Genshin Impact, which is that for a normal player, this constellation will never appear, right? Like, unless they play for like 5+ years, you are not getting this constellation. And therefore, the only reason this constellation exists is to bait people who are filthy rich and drop tons of money on games like this. That's what it's there for. And that's why it's actually kind of basic. Like, it's just sort of a thing that's already true about the character. And you don't really have to do anything to make it valuable, right? You don't really need an understanding of the game, which people dropping a huge amount of money on the game and then just blindly putting all the characters they got on a team, those players don't have an understanding of the game. And so that actually is weirdly appropriate for those players. Now, I think that's a bad idea because, well, a lot of reasons actually, but one of them is that it's confused. Making there be some kind of premium ability that allows you to unlock this effect on a character rather than confusingly putting it in line with things that like normal players are supposed to have would add some clarity. It might just look awkward. So I don't know. I think it's worth mentioning the whale thing. I feel like a lot of the critique that we've been discussing here relies on the idea that the player understands this character and has played them for a long time, both of which the whale audience doesn't. Not that every single person who whales on a game doesn't understand it at all, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. That's all I have to say, I think. EyePatchNotes has a little outro. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I ultimately think that Parley is a collaborative effort, even if the way I use it does not quite line up with what it was made for. At least part of my motivation is naming or at least drawing attention to specific topics with an off-kilter perspective. We talked about this in a previous Parley, is rewarding for me to hear, especially during a live stream, because it can provide a point of reference for an otherwise novel question. Building a community vocabulary or colored history of interpretations is one of the many reasons I stick around. Well, I'm glad that you enjoy that. That's the thing I care about a lot too. For me, there's this difficulty of balancing, like, I don't want people to feel like there's required reading for streams. At the same time, I do think that in the world of making builds and discussing game design like this, you do need to build up some vocabulary, and in particular, this is an odd area of discussion where there are a number of topics that kind of need a term, but there literally isn't one. Like, you kind of have to define your own terms for a lot of them. That has been a difficulty. I'm going to be focusing on that more in future videos. It's been difficult for me to balance making videos that are building up a growing understanding that is their beneficial coursework, if you want to think of it that way, but not required reading. In other words, you can enjoy every new video even if you haven't watched any of the videos, or almost every video, on the ZanyPants channel, by the way. Yet we are working toward a larger goal with those videos. I think you can do both at once, but that has been hard. You might think that because that usually doesn't apply both things to one person at a time, you might have thought before, why do the Zandy videos need to be structured this way? Or this isn't so hard, you know, you could make more of them. I probably can make more of them. Stay tuned for more Zandy videos. But part of the reason is managing that, trying to make sure they're building towards something, because I feel that it's a something that we need or that would be useful, and yet making sure that they're followable if you haven't, you know, followed along with that stuff. It has been particularly warping to my perspective to stream as consistently as I have while having videos have a bumpy ride toward getting to the stable, kind of healthier point that they're getting to now. Because it makes it difficult to remember exactly what experience the ZanyPants audience on YouTube has had. You know, they don't, and they're not watching these videos statistically, so they don't know any of this stuff. And I think it's fairly important, fairly foundational. Anyway, I thought this was great. Thank you, EyePatchNotes, for, I actually recommended that you did this parlay. We were talking about your previous parlay, and you sent some DMs to me that I thought, ooh, not like that, that I thought were really well put. And I said, just make this your parlay. It's good. And I thought it was good. So I hope you enjoyed it too. Yeah, If you want to get a parlay like this for yourself, you can skip to do that just below the video in the description. I'd love to have you aboard. For now, I'll say thank you very much, EyePatchNotes. Talk to y'all soon.